Today, April 11th, 1995, the testimony of Peter Daniels, interviewed by Mark Rothman in Los Angeles, California, United States of America. The language will be English.
My name is Mark Rothman. I'd like to make a correction to the slate. It's April 12, 1995. We're in Los Angeles. I'm with Peter Daniels. We're speaking English. Good morning, Mr. Daniels. Thank you very much for speaking with us this morning. Why don't you start by introducing yourself?
My name is Peter Daniels, Heinz Daniels.
If you could spell your name.
Yes, the last name is Daniels.
And your first and middle names?
Peter Heinz.
And spell them, please.
Peterheinz.
Why don't you begin by telling us where you were born?
Berlin, Germany.
And when?
July 8th, 1936.
Can you tell us anything about your parents?
My mother was raised in a mixed Jewish home. Her father was Jewish, her mother was non-Jewish. And my father was raised in a Jewish home. His family was his father was was an attorney in Germany, and my father was. I don't think he started his profession at the time he became my father. They were both in their mid-20s.
What were their names?
My father's name is Eric, E-R-I-C. Daniels, and my mother's name was Hilda Berlowitz, Berlowitz.
And how is Hilda spelled?
Hilde.
Do you know anything about how they came together or what their life was together?
It was a brief romance, if the truth be told. It wasn't a long relationship, and it was I like to think I was a loved child.
Did your mother talk about that at all as you were growing up? Was it hard for her? Or?
Yes. Yes, it took many, many years before my mother would even allow that information. And at that point, it was a lot of prodding, and that's about as much as I know about that affair.
Do you know very much about your mother's life before you were born?
Well, her father came from the Polish border. His father was a school teacher. They wanted to send their son, who was my mother's father, to a larger city, so they sent him to Berlin in his early youth. It was probably about 1870, 1880. He went to work for a steel or metal manufacturer, became like a personal assistant, and he did actually quite well. He was a founder of the Weller Poseidon Rowing Club in Berlin on the Wannsee, where the Wannsee Conference took place. And that club was founded in 1895, I believe, 1890 or 1995. He was one of the co-founders. And so he became somewhat of a fixture in the Jewish community. And for the life of me, I do not remember his first name. His last name, of course, was Berlowitz, but I do not remember his first name.
Did you have much contact with him as a little boy?
No. I don't remember him. He probably knew me. He died in 1941, so I was 5 years old. And because of his somewhat status in Berlin, he was able to stay out of the being deported to the camps. But he did die in 1941, so in Berlin.
Was he murdered by the Nazis, or
no,
did he die?
No, I think he died in natural causes.
And what kind of early childhood do you remember having?
Well, my childhood was not very pleasant because I was born in 1936, And by the time I was probably ready to go to school, which is 1939, 1940, the schools were already shut out for us. So I never did attend any public schools. And it was my mother and I. There was no father in the house. In fact, his family and he went to Shanghai with a very large group of Germans that migrated to Shanghai in the late 30s. So I never saw him. I don't even know if he knew who I was. And actually, I never even saw a picture of him. I have no idea what a man even looks like. I'm sure he's not even alive anymore. But we lived in an apartment in Berlin, and my mother had to go out and work. She had to try to find work. She was a seamstress and a dressmaker, and attempted to find work. She would leave me alone all day long in an apartment when I was 3, 4, 5. She had no choice.
No one came in?
No, nobody came in. I mean, the Germans were never much for babysitters anyway. It was just never much of a tradition to have a babysitter. I guess you just learned to make do early on. And of course, in those days, she couldn't afford a babysitter, and who else would be a babysitter for a Jewish kid anyway? So she just basically trained me early on to fend for myself. She would have whatever food there was available sitting there. She told me what time to eat, what time to go to the bathroom, never to leave the house. Gave me lessons, she had prepared some lessons for me, so she basically tutored me at home. So I lived my early years pretty much as very much alone, essentially locked up in an apartment because I was not allowed to leave the house by myself.
What would you do all day?
Well, I don't really remember specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I'd sit in front of the window, look out the window a lot, and I guess I found ways of amusing myself. And of course I had studies. So my mother would give me some lessons that I had to do, and those had to be completed by the time she came home. I guess I was reading or whatever else I would do, but I spent a lot of time by myself, but I don't remember specifically,
One thing you mentioned is that you were told what time to eat. Do you remember learning to tell time?
No, I don't remember learning to tell time. It was probably drummed into me very early on. I suppose if I didn't and I ate too early, I was hungry all day, I learned the next day. So I don't really recall learning time, but she had put me on a schedule that I had to follow. So.
And do you remember having cousins or
No.
uncles and aunts?
No. I think there were a couple of relatives. I think my mother had a relative. I don't know if she had a cousin that lived outside of Berlin, lived in small suburbs of Berlin that we might have occasionally visited. I remember traveling trains, occasionally to visit somebody out in the country, but it was so rare that it wasn't very prevalent in my mind. It's just some vague recollections.
Was your mother born in Berlin?
Yes, she was born in Berlin.
After your grandfather had come from Poland?
Right,
okay.
Exactly.
And did she have friends? Do you remember if she spent time with friends at all?
I don't remember. I don't remember too many people in my life outside my mother.
Do you remember any kind of Jewish life?
No Jewish life whatsoever.
Were you aware of yourself as a Jew?
Yeah, I knew I was Jewish because we had to wear a Jewish star. From the time I remember, we had to wear a Jewish star when we left the house on all of our clothing. So I knew that concept. But as far as religious training or even cultural training as a Jew, we never got it. I knew I was Jewish, and I knew that there were a lot of restrictions on me, and that I couldn't leave the house without the star, and I knew that I couldn't go to school, and I knew that you know, of those limitations because I was Jewish, although nobody ever sat me down and gave me a lesson in Judaism. So I was not able to incorporate that or internalize that.
And you don't seem to have had opportunity to make any friends with other, I guess, only Jewish kids, but did you have any childhood friends?
No. If I did, they were very fleeting. I wouldn't recall them.
Do you remember celebrating any of your early birthdays?
Yes, I remember. I remember one. Interesting that you asked. It was in a I don't know if it was my fourth or fifth birthday. My sixth birthday, I may have arrived. Fifth or sixth, I think the seventh I was already in a camp. It was at a kinderheim or some kind of a nursery school or a preschool that my mother was able to get me into for a short period of time. And I remember it was my birthday one day, and while I was there, and I remember that I got into a confrontation with another child. And it was probably because he called me a dirty Jew or something. I mean, most of the time, those are the only things that would trigger me off. And I remember throwing a pair of scissors. And the scissor actually cut the kid. It wasn't life-threatening, it just cut him. So they locked me in a closet. That's how they handled things. They just locked me in a closet. And then my mother came with a birthday cake. And they all had their birthday cake while I was sitting in the closet watching them eat birthday cake. So it was a lesson. Yeah, that was a birthday I remember.
A painful lesson.
Yes, painful lesson. And anyway.
Well, what happened next in your life?
Well, while we were living in the apartment, the main thing my mother always admonished me is never open up the door to anybody. Absolutely, never open up the door to anybody. And so one day, there was a knock on the door, and I was able to get through the peephole, and I saw 2 or 3 men in white in business suits. Of course, I opened up the door like I shouldn't have, and they were the SS. And they came and asked where my mother was. I said, no, she's not, and she'll be home soon. So they waited. They were very polite. They waited. I don't recall how long it was, a few hours. But when she came home, I do remember seeing her, and she knew immediately who they were. And I don't think we were home 5 minutes. She just came in, grabbed the bags, locked the door, and they took us.
Were the bags packed?
No bags packed, nothing. They just closed the apartment. All she was able to grab was a purse, and off we went. Do you want me to go on the sequence of events?
This is very interesting.
Yeah, so we went to the local train station where we were gathered with hundreds, I'm sure it wasn't thousands, but it was many, many other Jews, and we were ready to be transported. At that point, I had no idea where we were going, but it was at the local train station. And I don't know if we were there for days. It seems like it. I remember hanging around and sitting and sleeping. It could have been there 24 hours, 30 hours. It was no food. We just all hanging around. And then I wasn't feeling very well, and I was getting ill. And we were all hanging around, and at one point a couple of German, officers in a uniform came by, and they noticed that I was ill, and one of them recognized that I had, at that point I found out later, that I had jaundice. So he immediately had ordered me taken away, sent to the local hospital for treatment, and whatever treatment they had at that point, I don't know if they even had any vaccination, but they actually isolated me in a hospital unit, and I was able to recuperate there for about a week. This gave my mother a chance to go back to the apartment, straighten out whatever affairs. I think she was able to pack some of her personal belongings. She may be able to hide a few things, I don't know. And she did visit me once or twice in the hospital. And must have been there a week, maybe 10 days. And then when I recuperated from jaundice, then we were then shipped out. We went to another one of these things with the train stations. I don't remember that time frame very well. At that point, we may have been loaded onto the trains almost immediately, I think. I found out a lot of years later, in fact, it was my mother that told me probably only a few years later, that that German officer who had separated me out from the rest and ordered me to the hospital was Adolf Eichmann. It was at that point, he was in charge of that. That was his job at that time. He was gathering all of the people in Germany for transporting.
And yet he showed you some kindness.
Well, I don't know if he showed me kindness. Maybe he didn't want an epidemic right there in the heart of Germany, in Berlin, because we were headed for Theresienstadt, and at that point, Theresienstadt was not, in '43, was not considered to be a death camp or it was considered to be sort of like a way station, the model camp, and.
Had you heard anything about it? Did you have any idea where you were going?
I had no idea. We didn't know. I didn't know where I was going. My mother may have known, but I was not aware. I may have been aware, but it didn't register to me. But this was a train station in Berlin. That's the last thing he wanted, was probably, he didn't want an outbreak of jaundice or yellow fever or whatever else may have occurred right then and there. They would have had a mess on their hands. So whether it was kindness or it was just expeditious for him just to get rid of that source immediately and just take care of that and move everybody out, I think was probably from his organized mind. That was his thinking.
And how were you treated in the hospital? Do you remember?
I don't recall. It wasn't bad. I don't remember. It wasn't. I think I was probably just another patient.
Do you remember missing your mother?
No. I don't remember. I might have, but I don't remember. Yeah.
And what happened next?
Well, then we went to. Then we were loaded onto the. When I left there, we were loaded onto the trains. They were not Amtrak. I can tell you this. I can truly know that all those cattle cars that you see in the Holocaust museums were truly the ones. And I do remember being in one of those. They were just disgusting.
Were you with your mother?
I don't remember. I think I was. I think I was with my mother. But we were all standing or sitting. They were not seats. I mean, they were basically just cattle cars. And we were headed to Czechoslovakia.
Were you given any food?
I don't recall.
Bathroom facilities, do you remember?
I think they probably stopped the cars once or twice for us to get out. Well, we had to go to the bathroom and then we were loaded back on. I don't recall, but I would think.
Do you remember how long you were on?
No. I don't recall, but I figure probably couldn't have taken more than 24 hours, maybe 30 hours. I don't know. I mean, from Berlin to Prague, it's not that great of a distance. Train is moving on pretty rapidly.
A question I've always wondered about is, could you tell it was night or day in the car?
I don't recall. It seemed like it was always night. It seemed like it was always night. But I know that when we got there, it was night. It was cold. It was in January '43. It was in the middle of the night. I know that we got out of the car. I remember we getting out and walking en masse to the barracks in Theresienstadt. I don't know how long we walked. It seemed like we walked a long time, maybe an hour, maybe. I don't, I'm just thinking I was 6 years old. So, and we walked, and then we had no idea where we were going. They just herded us into some barracks just to get rid of us, I guess, just to put us someplace until they had a chance to organize us. And I remember sleeping on a cold floor. I remember there were rats. I will remember hearing noises. I guess it must have been in an attic or some kind of a large hall that we were sleeping in. There were no lights. I remember the first night. It was really kind of scary. And then I don't remember the sequence of events after that. I was separated from my mother. I was put into a children's compound within the camp. My head was shaven. The children's compound, I never did understand why they separated us out. I guess probably expeditiously, that way it'll control the parents. Maybe the parents wouldn't try any funny business if their children were separated from them. And I don't know how many children were there at one time, but it was a separate barrack, and there could have been 50, 60, 75 children. They're just faces. I don't remember any one in particular. I don't think I recall any one or two children that I knew for any length of time. I think they just sort of came and went. And that's basically where we were housed. I saw my mother. I was supposed to see her. I mean, you know, they made it a point for me to visit with my mother once a week. Whatever time I saw her, I think they were really kind of uneventful. I don't recall. I don't recall them being very loving or emotional. I think it was just sort of duty-bound. So I didn't really see her very often while we were in a camp.
It's still amazingly humane for the world of the camps that they allowed you to have any contact with her.
Yeah, I suppose.
Just when you look at it in terms of how children were treated at other camps.
Right, exactly.
That's
in
all
that
I'm
sense,
saying.
yeah, absolutely. I will agree that in retrospect, we were very lucky to have been in that camp. We were, I don't really know what the goals were. I never did find out what they had in mind for us. I know one of the reasons that we were in the camp is because my mother was able to convince the authority. It took a while that she was not 100% Jewish because of her mother was non-Jewish. So she was able to get some paperwork out, and I don't think they were entirely convinced, but during the time that they were researching the fact that she had some, God forbid, Aryan blood in her, but it was a non-Jewish blood. And I really don't know what religion her mother was. I have no idea. She wasn't, I don't even know what her relationship with her real mother was. But during that time, the authorities were just said, well, we'll just keep you here until we make a determination whether we should send you on to other camps. So we basically stayed in Theresienstadt till the end of the war.
Now, do you remember what day-to-day life was like? Did you go to school there, or just
We had
work?
lessons. We had there was some semblance of order. There was some women. There were some Jewish women who were designated as being our. I don't know the right word. I don't think it was nursemaids. They were just sort of in charge of us. I believe they tried to tutor us. I think they tried giving us some lessons. I don't really recall. I did have some freedom. I did have some ability to be off on my own. I don't think they kept very close track of us there, the children, or if they did, it's not like I was gone for days, but I was able to slip away from the regiment during the day for some time and wander off on my own. So I was somewhat of a loner, and I was able to explore some of the areas of the camp, and so I was able to snoop around a lot of different areas. I don't recall a lot of things, but I remember being alone a lot. Not being lonely, but just being alone. I was sort of always exploring a little bit.
Where would you go?
Just within the camp.
Did you have a favorite place? Do you
Probably, I think I remember being on top of a little hill, on top of a knoll, and just sort of looking down at the barracks. Theresienstadt was a sort of like, it was a barracks. It was a soldier's barracks at one time, like a garrison. So it had barracks, and it had administrative buildings, and then of course it had some open spaces, green spaces they call them today. And so I was able to, I would not go into buildings, but I don't recall exactly, just remember just, exploring a lot on my own.
And did any commanders or SS guards ever find you, or?
I probably, but I don't remember being treated harshly, personally, as far as physical harm. I remember we didn't eat very much. We had barley soup. I was raised on barley soup, and I love barley soup today. That's all, barley soup, 20 times a day. Well, one time a day, I guess. It's not very much else. Couple of instances, things I remember. I know that they used to bring food supply into the camp on some of the trains, and we used to, a few times, we would sneak out in the middle of the night, in the dark of night, kids, and we would find our way to the railroads, and we would crawl underneath the railroad cars and look for small potatoes that used to fall in between the cracks. If they were small enough, they would fall between the cracks. And so we would gather up some potatoes and bring them back to the barracks with us, and we'd slice them up, and we would lay them right on top of the stove. We had our own way of making French fries, I guess. That was a highlight of some of our days or nights, because those trains would come in maybe once a month or something like that, and we always knew there were a few potatoes that would fall. And I'm sorry, David.
Yeah, you mentioned that there were certain, not nursemaids, not really capos, it sounds like. Were they very cruel?
No, I don't recall. I don't recall them being cruel. I don't recall them being loving.
Did they try and impose any kind of discipline?
I don't recall. I don't recall them being harsh. I don't recall them being... Would you like me to shut that dog up?
Oh, I'm not sure we're hearing it on the
Okay,
tape.
fine.
It's fine.
They're vague. They're just vague recollections of mine. They were not very large, or they didn't make a very large impression on me, so I don't recall them with any clarity. I don't remember them being cruel or kind. I think they were just, it was really very neutral to me.
Did they change? Was there any consistency?
I don't recall. No, I don't recall. No.
Now, you mentioned that you were finding potatoes. Were there other things like that you did?
Well, I remember we were in the children were in work parties, and it was an interesting incident that I had recalled a number of years ago, and at a few times I had related this incident. The interviewer I was talking to at that time had never heard of that type of an incident from any of the other children that she interviewed, and so it was always something I thought, well, was I dreaming it and all that? And then, I'll get to the incident in a minute, they interviewed somebody else on the East Coast for the same archives.
This is the Yale archives?
Yes, and it was amazing because it was a little girl who related that same incident. It's completely independent of mine 2 or 3 years later, so they realized over time that it actually happened, but very few kids remembered it. And it was that we were loading up, a human chain gang were loading up boxes. I think we were loading them on cars rather than unloading them, and they were just sort of like white boxes.
And when you say a chain gang, you mean you're passing the box from one?
Right, passing the boxes from one child to the next, from one of the warehouses going up right into the cars. And we really didn't know what they were until one of those boxes dropped and fell and opened up, and there was a human skull. And I had talked about that. I'd never heard of anybody else remembering that until that an independent corroboration occurred on the East Coast, and it must have been another child
who saw the same box,
who was in that same work party as I was in that same day.
How did you react when that happened?
I don't recall. It was probably pretty scary. It was probably
Daniels. Now, you were telling about the incident where you were working and this box broke open. Have you had any contact with that other child survivor?
No. No, this was just related to me by the person who interviewed me for that first tape. Called me a few years later, and she was somewhat amazed when a colleague of hers called her from the East Coast. I think they communicate on a regular basis, and they probably discuss certain aspects of stories coming from the children. And so that came up, and so she remembered my explanation of that, and she called me. So it was kind of vindicate, because you sometimes wonder, did I see it someplace, or did I read it or something? Was it a dream or not? So
it sounds like it would be more of a nightmare.
Yeah, I don't. I can't dredge up the same emotions I'd felt at that time. I don't really recall, but I'm certain being 7 or 8 years old, I'm sure it wasn't very comfortable.
What other kinds of forced labor would they have you do?
I don't recall. I don't think there was very much.
What happened next when you were in Trusenstadt?
Other than those few isolated instances, I don't really recall anything. Consciously, I don't really recall very much. I'm not quite sure what I would recall if I were to be put on Demerol or something. I'm not quite sure. I don't think I suffered, personally, I don't think I suffered a lot of tragedies which would force me to suppress information. I think it was probably just childhood, memory lapses. I think,
though the whole situation is pretty traumatic, being deported because of your identity and separated from your mother.
Yeah, that may be, but I think my mother prepared me for it. I did not come from a very loving home where there was a lot of Judaism, and where I was pulled away from my family and separated. The circumstances that my mother faced prior to us going to the camp forced us already to be in a position of being independent of each other, and she had no choice. Otherwise she would have starved too. So it probably wasn't as traumatic to me as it might have been for somebody else. So, but actually, the next thing I remember that was probably the most joyous thing I remember is the Russians coming, and that was in early May. I think we've heard some rumors before that things were happening in our favor, that the war was over, the Allies had landed or something. But we were on the Eastern Front, so the Soviets actually came in and liberated the camp. And I do remember the tanks rolling down the streets and passing by us.
Now, in the camp, could you see beyond the barbed wire?
Yes.
What could you see?
Well, we could see the road, or we could see, the roads where the main transports would be, where the main highway, or the main, I wouldn't call it a highway, but the main thoroughfare was going. And that's where the Russians came in. We saw them. I mean, we were behind barbed wires, but we saw them very clearly, heard them. And of course there was a lot of cheering and weeping and so forth going on. And I remember the Russians did throw us some food, whatever it was, some rations, just as a goodwill gesture. And the Russians, I will, to their credit, they maintained order. They did not open up the gates and let everybody rush out. I think they came in and set up some kind of a orderly program to let people go where they needed to go and to move them to other areas of the country. I do remember one instance, and I don't know if this happened after they came, just before they did, but we were already aware that the Germans were losing the war, and many of the German guards were abandoned in these camps. And I remember sleeping one night, waking up in the middle of the night with hearing a lot of noise, and I looked out the window, and I saw a bonfire, and a whole group of Jewish inmates around there with sticks and pitchforks, whatever they had, and they had found a German guard who they had located. He probably didn't get a chance to get away, and they had him running into that fire. And every time he ran out of the fire, they would beat him and they'd shove him back into the fire until finally, and it was fascinating. I was just mesmerized by this whole thing. I was probably watching it for maybe, seems like a long time, maybe been 5-10 minutes, until finally he fell into the fire where he passed out. And so that was his mistake by not getting out. And it was right during that time when we were being liberated. And
now, do you remember a moment when it was clear there were no guards around the camp?
it was probably about that time when most of the guards had either been captured or had escaped. And there was probably some straggler or somebody who was unable to get away, or they captured him. So it was at that time that we basically were free of the German control, and the Russians were then in control.
As a prelude to liberation, sometimes it seems people have realized something was happening because suddenly they woke up in the morning and there were no Germans. Do you remember any moment like that?
No. Again, a lot of what I'm here, a lot of my recollection is sort of muddy, and I don't know if I recalled it exactly at the time. Was it my independent recollection at the time I was there, or did I hear about it later, and did I associate it with the time I was there? But I know one recollection I had, and again, I don't know at what point it was, where there were rumors floating around that this camp was going to be liquidated, eliminated, whether it was going to be they were building gas chambers, or they were going to move us out. But it was probably somewhere about March, April, when the Germans realized that the tide was turning and they really had to get rid of a lot of inmates. And there was a rumor floating around, and now I don't know if I heard about it later or if I heard about it at the time. And I don't know what the reaction was, but it was definitely information that was coming through that they were building gas chambers, or either building them or preparing for us for that. But I don't recall how I felt at the time. I mean, I remember hearing about this thing, and I don't know if I felt close enough to associate myself with it at the time. At that point, we may have been just so beaten down that, it may have just been another phase of our lives. I don't know. But anyway, in May, first week, second week in May, I don't remember. First week in May, I believe, is Soviets came. But it was pretty close. I think it was pretty close that they came by in the time that the inevitable was supposed to happen to us. I think it was just a matter of weeks.
And did you actually ever see any activity for building these gas chambers?
No, I personally didn't. If I did, I don't recall. So anyway, then the Soviets came. I don't recall very much after that. My mother and I went to Berlin at the time. She had, she wasn't quite sure what she was going to do. But anyway, just go back to Berlin, to the city where we found some apartment. I don't recall who it was with. I don't know how she managed to pay them. I don't know if she knew those people, but I remember staying in an apartment, a one-room apartment, right down the street from an American, not the headquarters, but from an American administrative office where there were a lot of American soldiers housed. I remember seeing American flags there. and we met a lot of American soldiers. And my mother at that time began a relationship with my stepfather, who was going to become my stepfather just very shortly thereafter. And I remember following the steps. I remember Berlin. I remember Berlin was just a rebels. I remember wandering the streets. Of course, there was no school. I was at that time, I was 9. In the summer of 45, looking at Berlin and all the rubbles and not seeing very many buildings up and just wandering the streets. I think I had probably taken up company with a couple of other kids my age, and we would just wander the streets. And we would follow the American soldiers, and they were smoking cigarettes, and they would flip the cigarettes, and we weren't smoking ourselves, but we would gather all these cigarettes all day long, and we would bring them home, and our parents would take these butts, and they would open them up and have a little tobacco so they could make their own cigarettes. That was the pleasure of their lives. I remember also where the building next door or down the street where the Americans had administrative offices, they would have all these coffee pots, and they would just dump their coffee grinds in these trash cans, and we would go in very carefully. We would scrape off some of the coffee grinds, careful not to get anything else in there, and we would put them in little bags and take them home. And of course our parents would sort of regrind this coffee 15 times, things of that nature. I don't know how long that was, 6 months, a year. And then I believe my mother at that time, and I don't know if my stepfather was there. I don't know if they had gotten married at that time. She had met him in a camp in Theresienstadt. At the time, he was a work party, and he would go with a work party to different camps, and he was in Buchenwald. He spent time in Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen.
As a liberator?
No, as an inmate. He was Jewish.
But he wasn't American?
No. He was also a German Jew.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Now, I got confused because you mentioned that you met him. She met him close to the building where the American.
Oh no! They
officers.
had taken no. She had. Excuse me. I'll regress. They had met in Theresienstadt.
Mm-hmm.
He was of a work party. He came through as a work party, but he had also been in Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. But he had survived. He was a fairly strapping man, and he had come to Theresienstadt as a work party, and that's where they had met, and man-woman thing, and then when we were liberated, he was already someplace else. But they had established enough of a relationship where they had wanted to connect again. And I don't recall, she tells me later on in life that she actually had to locate him. And he was down south. He had wound up down in southern Germany near this DP camp. And for some, there was quite a network going on with bulletin boards and whatever, word of mouth of, have you seen so-and-so, have you seen so-and-so? So by sheer luck and tenacity, she was able to locate him. And so she had located him. Then, I don't know the sequence of events, but at that time, she had found out that the highest organization then would take in the Jews and give them an option of where they would want to send the Jews, either to Israel or to America or back to Germany and so forth.
What organization?
The highest, it's a Jewish relief agency.
Mm-hmm.
And HIAS.
Do you know if it must have stood for something?
Hebrew Immigration Association Society, something like that.
Okay.
They're still around, I think. I don't know if they changed their names or not, but one of the cards that I'm unable to locate right now, an identity card, actually is from the highest group, which had my picture on it and my stamp on it, which allowed me to board the ship to come to America.
Oh.
So anyway, we wound up in the DP camp in Deggendorf in about 1946.
With
with my mother
stepfather?
and my stepfather at that time. They had gotten married.
And what was his name?
Max, M-A-X, Kurlander, K-U-R-L-A-N-D-E-R. He was born in Breslau, in the eastern part of Germany, and came from a very, very well-to-do family. They actually had sent him as a young man to Czechoslovakia. He spoke a lot of languages, and they had sent him to Czechoslovakia to become a tutor to wealthy Jews. And he traveled extensively. And at the time that he was over there, the winds of war were, if I can steal Herman Walk's title, were already adrift, and his family back in Breslau gathered all of their family, and they left Europe. He didn't want to go for some reason or other. He chose to remain. But his father and 3 brothers and family all moved to South America. And he never saw them again. As far as we know, they're still there, that family's still there, but he never made contact with them again.
Wow.
So he stayed in Europe, stayed in Germany, actually Czechoslovakia, and came back to Germany, and that's where he actually was taken. And then subsequently, a number of years later, he met my mother in one of the camps. And so they reconnected again in 1945, late of 1945, 1946. Connected, went to the DP camp in outside of Munich. We stayed there for a couple of years until August of 1947, at what point we were able to come to America.
Now, do you remember your life in the DP camp at all?
Yes, it was pretty bad. The DP camp was also a sort of it may have been a barracks at one time, a soldiers' barracks, and it was used to house immigrants, homeless, stateless persons. And my mother at that time thought that I should start a formal schooling. So she sent me to a local grade school outside of the DP camp. It was called, I don't remember the school, but the name of the town was Deggendorf, which is a few kilometers south of Munich. And the sheer stupidity of sending a Jewish kid to an all-goyim school in Munich, outside of Munich. I don't know where her head was at, but we just came from this whole horrible experience, and she sent me to school, and obviously I was Jewish. They knew exactly the first day I walked in who I was. I mean, it's not like I was an observant Jew and I had wearing a kippah, but they knew I was Jewish. And for every day, I would get beat up by all these kids. These kids my age would just gang up on me, and I would come home every day bloodied. And I tried to convince my mother that this is not a place for me. Besides not learning anything, I was scared to death to go into that school, and she kept sending me to that school. Whether she wanted to get me out of my hair, but there was no schooling for kids in that camp, in that DP camp. In a displaced person camp. It was basically, it wasn't set up for that. It was sort of like a way station, so every parent had to make the decision on their own of what they were going to do with their school-aged children. So she decided to send me to school. Maybe she wanted to just get me out of her hair, or so I was going to get an education, or what, but this lasted, well, then of course I'd start playing hooky. I mean, I just wouldn't go. And then she found out, then she would beat me. So it was a matter of either her beating me or getting beat up by those kids. And so finally, I think she finally realized it was futile to send me over there. And so I really never did get much of an education. So when I was just about 11 years old, we finally got onto one of the transport ships from Bremen, and steerage passage to America.
Now, could you read at this point?
Oh, I'm sure I could. I'm sure I had basic rudimentary, I wasn't illiterate. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I wasn't well educated, but I wasn't illiterate. I'm sure I could read. And you know.
Simple math? Do you remember doing any?
I don't recall. I probably very simple math. I think there was no reason for me to use math, but I'm sure I could use my basic, you know, multiplication tables. I'm sure I had that down. I'm sure I could read, and I knew I could probably write to some degree. Maybe not at not at an 11-year-old level, but probably at a 8 or 9-year-old level, I believe.
Do you remember reading books at all? Do you have a favorite
not
book?
There. No, there really wasn't very much to read. I think we didn't have very much reading material. But I did recall having to do certain things for my mother while we were before the camp when I was 4 or 5. I mean, I did have some. She was tutoring me, and I did have some lessons. So I did have some basic educational material to follow.
Mm-hmm. And you could write? I mean, it sounds
I
like
think
those
I could
lessons.
write. I'm sure I could, yeah. German, don't forget, German.
A very important point.
Yeah, German.
Yeah.
So...
and so do you remember anything about the steerage passage?
I remember eating like a pig. I shouldn't say that, you know, God forbid, I shouldn't say eating like a pig, but the food was, well...
It's very descriptive.
Yes, the food was good. I remember eating and getting sick and eating and getting sick. I think it was probably the first time in my memory that I had milk or cakes or something. Even though we had food in the DP camp, it was still very basic. And it was probably still soup and potatoes and, you know, bread. So we were able to eat. The trip must have lasted 6-7 days.
Now, when you said you got sick, it was seasick?
Seasick, yes. Mm-hmm.
But you would still eat?
I would still eat. And I remember seeing the Statue of Liberty. I remember the emotions of arriving in America.
And what was that like?
Well, we were standing up on the deck. We knew the Statue of Liberty. I mean, we knew that this was America. And of course, it was on our mind for many years, at least during the DP camp. Once we got to the DP camp, my parents already decided that America was the place to go. They did not choose Israel, although we had the opportunity to go, but it was their decision. I didn't have a choice in that.
And it sounds like South America wasn't much of an option. It sounds like your stepfather didn't have much connection with his family.
No.
Or much interested in having one.
It was America.
Yeah.
I mean, it was America first, second, and foremost.
Was one of the languages Max spoke English?
Yeah, he spoke English. He spoke about 7, 8 languages, and he spoke English too.
And your mother, did she have any English?
No, she spoke German was her only language, and German was my only language. I did speak some Czech, because there were a lot of Czechoslovakians in the camp with us. And so I was told that I spoke Czech years later, but I don't recall it, and I obviously forgot I obviously don't recall any of it. So, but I remember coming into Ellis Island, unloading and sitting and going through the processing and, you know, stamping us.
Did you have anything with you? Any possessions at all?
A suitcase.
Anything in there that you cared about?
No. I think we landed, and I think they gave us each person $14 or $15. They took us and they allowed us. I think the highest had a building that we could stay in for a few days until we found a place to live. I mean, they obviously didn't want to dump us on the docks and say, here, on your own. So they were able to get us to someplace down the Lower East Side. It was like an apartment building that they had taken over, and the highest group would allow the immigrants to stay there for whatever time it took us to find an apartment. And usually they encouraged us to do it very quickly. So I don't think we were there for days, maybe a week or so. But I and I spoke no English, but I did recall one day obviously there was no school. It was in August. School was not in session. I remember sort of wandering around the street there. Somebody comes up to me and said, do you want to go to a summer camp? And I didn't understand what the English was, but anyway, it was translated for me. And I said, sure. My mother said, fine. It turned out to be Eddie Cantor's Surprise Lake Camp. And they were very active in the immigrants' children of bringing them into camp. A much better camp than we came from. So I remember probably maybe 2 weeks after we arrived, we came into America on August 3rd, 1947. And in between August 3rd and probably the first week in September when school started, there was still a summer camp in session. So they shipped me up to upstate New York for a summer camp session, which was very nice. I spoke no English, but everybody was very nice. It was Jewish kids, obviously. And, you know, swimming in a lake and doing what kids do in a camp. And then coming back.
Now, when they asked you the question, would you like to go to summer camp, did you have any idea, even if it was translated, what they were talking about?
Well, yeah, they explained to us. They explained what it was.
So they didn't just ask you on the street, they met with your mother and...
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
Max.
I think it was somebody came into the, you know, must have been sitting on a stoop, you know, they knew who I was. Says, would you like to go to summer camp? I says, well, you know, speak to my mother or somebody. And they explained to her, and she said, great, you know, get me out of her hair. I think with her is just get rid of me, you know. I was not the great joy of her life. But although it was fine, I mean, I'm sure she didn't, I don't mean to speak ill of her, but it's just that in retrospect, I don't know. I get to thinking that a lot of mothers wouldn't want a kid out of there, would not want, after all this, all of a sudden they would take a kid, go upstate New York, who knows what these people are. We'll take you to another little camp, you won't see the kid for another 2 weeks. I think that a lot of Jewish mothers wouldn't have done it. They would have wanted to keep their kids and close by and close-knit family and all that. I believe a lot of Joan, my wife, would not have done that. If it had been her in the same situation, she said, no, you're not taking my kid. So, although it turned out to be a very positive experience, I think it was not much of a decision for her to say go. So anyway, I went up there. It was a nice positive experience. I remember the lake and just, you know, the trees and upstate New York. I didn't meet Eddie Cantor, but it was his camp.
Would you have known who he was if you did?
No, had no idea. Had no idea, but he sponsored it, and it was a very famous thing. And then we came back. And when we came back, my mother and stepfather at the time had already found an apartment down on the Lower East Side, Clinton Street and Houston Street, which was right in the heart of the Yiddish theaters there, and the whole 9 yards of what Jewish life really was. And so that's where they settled in for a number of years and started their life in America.
And how did your life start? What did you do next?
Well, I went to school, went to a local grade school there. Now, I was 11 years old. Never had any form of schooling.
That first day of school must have been, I mean, I can't see you going willingly.
Well, actually, I didn't go unwillingly. I was pretty flexible, and so I went. I was raised in a very strict authoritarian manner. Even though I was independent and somewhat of a loner, I did follow the instructions. And my mother says, "Go to school." I went to school.
Did you have fears that you'd be beat up again, like in Munich?
Probably, but I don't recall. But I did know that we were living in a Jewish neighborhood, so. But it's a good question. That question has never been asked of me, and I don't recall if I did, but if I did, that fear was alleviated fairly quickly. As soon as they knew I couldn't speak any English, maybe 2 or 3 weeks I might have been able to communicate a little better, but not enough to sit in the classroom. And those were the days before English as a second language. And so the school assigned a teenage girl to me who spoke German, who was obviously living in the neighborhood from a German family, but who spoke English. And I just sort of was in her tutelage for a couple of months. So she would help me out, help me learn English, help me get acclimated to the school, and help me. And then
she met with you one-on-one?
One-on-one, right, and after school and in class and so forth. I think she must have been 2 or 3 years older than I was. I don't recall her face, her name. You don't even recall her name because it didn't last that long. But I know that I remember the concept that had happened.
Daniels. Yeah, I didn't know it. You knew him, but you didn't know that that's his son-in-law.
No, I had no idea.
Oh, okay. He lives in Beverly Hills.
No.
Now, let's see, we were talking about the young lady, the young teenager, it sounds like about 14, 15-year-old, who was helping you
Right.
get
Yeah.
adjusted and learn English.
Right, exactly.
And that only lasted a few months.
That lasted a few months. I think she recognized that I was able to get off, to be able to handle it on my own. And then I pretty well blended in fairly nicely and was able to learn English, stay with my school, and at that point, I forgot what grade they put me in, but I think I remember they had to put me in a couple of earlier grades just to get started. And then when I was probably 13, 12, 13, I was already jumped in and I was already caught up in my regular grades. So the native intelligence was there. It's just a matter of me translating it into the English way of life, the American way of life. So then I just moved okay into that. So I wasn't held back. I wasn't sitting in a kindergarten class when I was older, yeah. And then I learned English fairly quickly, picked it up. I spoke very little German. I refused to, I had a lot of problems. The war, I think, the experiences affected my parents, my stepfather, my mother, tremendously. The experience that they went through, I think my stepfather went through some very bad in Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. He saw a lot. He never talked about it at all. I never knew anything while I was living with them. They never discussed anything, even though I know they went through it. I know that my mother went through a lot. It was just never a discussion. Wherever it came up with other survivors, they would just shut up. They'd never enter. They would never join in the conversations. Although some of their friends or people that they knew who were in the camps talked more about it, they never would. And so I grew up always with this idea that you just don't talk about it. And but they held a lot in too, and it just made life very, very bad for us all around. And then I left home. I mean, I just left home when I was about 14.
Now, did this new area that you were living in, being so Jewish as a Lower East Side, did that have any influence? Did you start acting more Jewish, doing any kind of things?
Not really. Not really, because they're both being German. There was, it's pretty well known, the attitude that the German Jews had. And I think there was a lot of, and I don't want to psychoanalyze German Jews, but I think there was a lot of ambiguity going on between German Jews. On the one hand, they always felt that they were sort of a little bit better and classier than the rest of the European Jews. But at the other hand, they realized that didn't help them any. They had to go through the same horrors that everybody else went through, and I think it just never reconciled in their own lives. And the other thing that bothered me it bothered me more in later life than it did at that time, but it bothers me more now as I look back, is that they kept identifying with Germany all this time. I know that we had met a lot of other Jews, Polish Jews, Russian Jews, Czechoslovakian, Dutch, all that. They recognized that they were not wanted by their country. Their country turned their backs on them, and they were very happy to be in America. With the German Jews, or at least the friends that we had, and they only associated with German Jews, other German Jews who were in the camps. A lot of them wanted to go back to Germany, and a lot of them kept visiting Germany. And it wasn't until years later I'm saying, what are you guys doing? You know, they've never been able to make that separation. And they kept speaking German at home all the time. They just never wanted to give that up. And I guess that those roots were so ingrained in them, and they gave me no Judaism, although my stepfather wasn't observant, but high holy days he would go to temple. My mother never went to temple at all. I never had. They attempted to send me to get a Jewish education in the Lower East Side when we came over, but it was your archetypical Jewish scholar. I mean, the one that you see in the movie, the little walk-up flat, and the beard, and the yarmulke, and the dingy hall, and it just wasn't. I didn't mind that so much, but I didn't get this philosophical installation of being a Jew. They just says, go there and learn. So it was very rote. That didn't work very well, so finally they dropped it. I didn't get encouragement at home. They didn't give me the value of being a Jew. They just says, go. Why? I don't know, because maybe the neighbors were doing it too, and they just felt that I ought to do it. So, but I knew I lived in a Jewish neighborhood, and some of it came through, but then we would start wandering out. I started associating with other kids in the neighborhood, and we would wander outside the Jewish neighborhood towards the Italian neighborhood and the Hell's Kitchen, and we would get into some altercations there too. I mean, we were called dirty kikes, even though we were living in the Lower East Side of New York. I don't care when it happened. But it wasn't as traumatic because we had safe haven to go back, and we had friends. We knew there was just, we knew that it wasn't sanctioned by the authorities like it was in Germany.
The anti-Semitism wasn't.
Right.
Now, you're a large man. Were your friends, did they ever call on you to defend them?
Well, I wasn't really large then. I was tall, but I was skinny.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't overpowering. I was just tall and gangly. You know, when I came to America, when I was at one time, I think when I was 15 or 16 years old, I may have been 6 foot tall, but I must have weighed 130 pounds. I mean, I was just a bag of beans. My nutrition just never caught up with me. And so I never had not very much flesh, you know. So, but I learned to fight in the streets. I mean, I learned to take care of myself. You know, growing up in New York, you had the opportunity to do it, and I think I had a little training in Germany, but you really can't defend yourself against 5 or 10 kids who really had it in their mind to, you know. But once I came to New York, it was a little different. I got a little more confidence of myself. So that was basically what my, Jewish background, I mean, at least right after the war, right after the camps.
And then how did it come about that you left home?
Well, life was pretty bad for me. Life was pretty bad for me, and my mother just really just didn't like me very much. I think she realized that the light of day that I wasn't a loved child, and I reminded her of my father. She probably thought, and we never really talked very much about it, but just various, just getting a basic understanding was that I just probably reminded her of all the bad things that happened in her life. And then she married a man who probably wasn't too crazy about me either. You know, he was marrying a woman that had a little baggage. He probably didn't have much choice. I probably didn't take to him. There wasn't a lot of warmth. I refused to take his name.
Now, did he ask you to?
Well, yeah, they asked me. Yeah, they asked me if I would change my name to his, and I refused. Don't ask me why. I don't know why.
How old were you then?
Well, I must have been about, I don't know, 9 or 10, maybe 11. Well, I came over here was in 11. It must have been about I was 11 or 12. But I saw no I saw no benefit of changing his name. He didn't like me any more than I liked him. I think he, you know, my mother was very brutal with me. Today, my mother would have been charged with child abuse. In those days, you know, it wasn't an issue, a social issue. But she would beat me, I mean, regularly beat me. And he would just stand in the back and just allow it to happen. He would either egg her on or not stop it. And so I looked at him as not being a father figure at all, or any role model. To me, he was just my mother's husband. And I saw no wisdom in taking on his name. So, you know, anyway, so my life was pretty bad. So when I was about 14, 13 or 14, I remember the day, I just left. I just got on a bus and I left. And I've been on my own ever since.
Did you have any idea where you were going?
Well, I went to Texas the first time, yes. I ran away. I mean, I ran away a few times.
Before this?
Yeah, before I ran away, you know, just couldn't take it, ran away. Police would find me, bring me back home. Why would they bring me back home? I told them, I said, I'm going to run away again next week. And you know, and then I was working part-time. I got some money I was able to hide. And then one day I just packed my bags, a little bag I had, and I got onto a Greyhound bus. And I went to Fort Worth, went to Texas.
Yeah, I'm very compelled by this part of your life, but I do want to ask you a background question. What was your part-time job?
Oh, just deliveries, you know, whatever I do after school, working for some kind of a delivery service on a bicycle in New York City, working for a delicatessen, delivering chickens to somebody, or messenger service, or, you know, whatever typical after-school work that teenage boys would be able to get on a bicycle. I didn't know what I was making, 25 cents an hour or whatever.
Which was probably a lot more then than it seems like now.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I wasn't getting any allowance. I had to do it, you know. And so I was able to, for some reason, I was able to squirrel away some money. I think maybe $50 or something. I don't know. I had enough money to buy a bus ticket.
That's $50 is a considerable amount.
I had enough money to buy a bus ticket to Fort Worth, Texas.
Now, how did you choose Fort Worth?
Well, I went into the Greyhound bus station and I laid down whatever money I had. And I says, how far will this take me? I mean, this is literally, how far will this take me? I mean, some idiot behind the glass counter never even looked up, you know, never said to me, well, you're too young to travel alone. He says, I don't know. He says, probably Fort Worth. I says, good, give me a ticket. He slid a ticket and I got into a bus. Went to Fort Worth. I must have been 14 and a half, 15 maybe. I you know, was young. Obviously too young to travel by myself, but who cared?
You did it.
I did it.
So you obviously were old enough.
I was old enough as far as the Greyhound bus guy was concerned. Got on the bus and left. And wound up in Fort Worth. I had no idea what I was going to do there, but the furthest away I got away from that abusive family of mine, the better off I'd be. I got off the bus and I started hitchhiking. I don't know where I was going. I was lost. But it turned out that a fella picked me up who had a ranch. And I went to work for him. He had 3 boys of his own, and I guess he recognized I was a runaway. And so, he must have recognized that anybody's going to run away from New York must have had a pretty good reason to run away all that way. There's no point in shipping me back. Besides, what were they going to do? So he says, you know, I'll take care of you. You know, you just work for me, and I'll give you some schooling and all that. And at that time, I think I left, you know, I don't think I went past this 8th grade or 9th grade. And so I worked for him for about a year on a ranch.
And when you got off the bus in Fort Worth, it must have looked incredibly different than what you left in New York.
Well, actually, you know, pardon me, actually I got off in Dallas. I was hitchhiking to Fort Worth. For some reason, I got off in Dallas. And Dallas, even in those days, had skyscrapers. This was like in When was this? 1952, 53? I don't really recall. But it was a downtown city, and I needed to get out of there. I guess I wanted to, maybe I saw a lot of Hopalong Cassidy movies. I don't know. I figured maybe I'll go to work on a ranch, and sure enough, I wound up working on a ranch. And this fellow picked me up, and worked for him for about a year and a half. And he sent me to school, local school there, and I continued school, but I never did graduate high school at all. After a while, I just kept wandering. I guess he realized that I don't know what he was a very amicable departing, but maybe I just didn't want to stay there. Maybe I was beginning to. Maybe I just had this need to keep moving a lot, to travel. I had no home. I was always alone, and I just had this need to continue doing that way. It's just part of my life. So for a number of years, I just traveled. When I say traveled, I wouldn't call it traveling. I kept moving. Hitchhiking all over the country. Rail cars, hitchhiking, buses, whatever mode. I lived in a lot of different states, a lot of different cities. And one time, I wound up back in New York a few years later, and I called up my mother. I said, I'm here. I called up from the payphone. I need a place to stay. And she said, I'm sorry. I got no room for you. I said, I only need like a couple of days, on your couch, sorry, no room, Well, I mean, look, I left home. She didn't know where I was. She was rid of me. So I said, okay. And I never saw her again for a lot of years after that. I guess that was the way it was going to be.
What would you do for money on the road?
Oh, I always managed to find a job someplace. I was, for better or for worse, she taught me to be self-sufficient. There was always work to be had, whether it was washing dishes in a restaurant or it was unloading trucks, going to work for a farm for a couple of days, picking tomatoes. Wherever it happens to be, I always manage to find work, whether it's for a day or a week or a month. But I always had an honest dollar in my pocket, always. And I learned to eat radishes off the fields, pick tomatoes, find an apple.
And where would you sleep in?
Sleep wherever I can.
Wow.
Bus stations, train stations, park benches.
Would you come to some places and sort of settle for a limited period of time?
Yeah, I'd settle for a month, 2 months, a week, whatever the situation was. I wound up in Florida there, and I lived in Florida for a number of years, and became a lifeguard down in Florida. Lived near the racetrack, the Flagler racetrack. Became a lifeguard. Then I left. I lived there for a couple of years in 55 and 56, 1955, 56. And then I had to move on. I guess it was a failed romance or some immature reason to leave. And then I started hitchhiking again and started traveling cross country. And I wound up in the state of Washington. Wound up working on a strawberry farm.
It almost... What were you looking for?
I had no idea. I never had a home. I had no roots. I had no friends. I had no family. I was lonely. I remember, maybe hitchhiking or going up and down the street, looking at homes and seeing people inside homes, probably very lonely. Why wasn't I not home? But knowing that I didn't belong there. So for a lot of years, I just sort of wandered on my own. I was just a hobo there. I mean, they don't use that term anymore, but I really was a hobo. Well, I say a lot of years. It seems like a lot of years in my life, but it probably was 2 years, 3 years. But they're a long time when you put them, while you're experiencing them.
You've described a period of
Yeah.
time from somewhere around the early 50, 51, 52
Yeah,
to 56.
57, yeah.
And now we've only got you in Washington,
Yeah,
and well, what happened next?
yeah. Well, actually, I wound up, I had heard through some correspondence that, this was in 1958, that I was of draft age at that point, draft age, 1958. That the Army was ready to call me. I wasn't a citizen at that country. I was always a green card. One thing good, I always kept my green card that I had to renew every year. So whatever city or state I was in January of every year, I would renew my green card. I'd go to the post office and renew it. But I up and joined the Navy in 1958, early 1958. And I heard that if I didn't, I was going to get drafted. I didn't want to go into the Army. I wanted a choice. So I said, well, let me go ahead and join the Navy. And I was in Centralia, Tumwater, where they make Olympia beer. And I joined the Navy. They shipped me down to San Diego, went to my boot camp there, and put me through my boot camp, and I became a sailor with the U.S. Navy.
That's an honorable thing to do.
A very honorable thing. I don't know if I did it because I was honorable, but I was happy to be in America, and I felt that, I don't know what was going through my mind. Maybe I felt, maybe my life was just probably not getting out of the toilet, and I figured maybe the Navy would have me something.
Was there an issue with you not being a citizen? Could you just go in as a legal resident?
Oh, sure. As long as I was a legal resident, yeah. In fact, I encouraged you to go in. And in fact, and I don't know if the law is still now or then, but in the service, all you have to do is go to if you're in the service for 3 years, you are eligible for citizen as opposed to being here for 5 years. So they gave you like a 2-year credit.
Mm.
But at that point, I'd already been here in a long time. And in fact, I tried to get us, and before that, I tried to become a citizen. And the reason I was never able to get to the application stage, because I was never able to account for where I was for the last 5 years. I mean, you basically had to account for almost every month of where you were. Well, you asked me in those days, where were you for the last 5 years? I had to have 3 pages. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was just bumming around all over this country. And so I would sit down, and once or twice I would sit down at the Immigration Bureau or the Federal Bureau, and I could not literally complete the application. So I would walk out, like I was literally like a stateless person. So one thing is with the Navy, I was in the Navy for 4 years. I mean, all I had to do in my application, I said U.S. Navy 4 years, boom, they had me. And in fact, I did become a citizen about 6 months before I was discharged, November of 1961. I finally decided I was going to become a citizen. It was a great time. I even changed my name at that time because I was known as Berlowitz all along, my mother's maiden name. So, and so in November of 1961, I was still in the Navy. I was scheduled to be discharged in May of '62. And I went ahead in San Diego and put my application in, did my studying, and then I became a citizen of America.
And at that time, you changed your name to Daniels?
I changed my name, right. They gave you one free name change. I changed my name to Daniels. And why did I change my name to Daniels? I found out that my real father's name was Daniels only a few years earlier. At that time, I was corresponding with my mother. And I told her that I needed to. In fact, I think prior to that, when I joined the Navy, I had to have proof of birth. I mean, I had no proof of citizenship. I wasn't a citizen. So she was able to send me my birth certificate. And it had my real father's name on it. It didn't register very much then, but at the time when I filled out the application, it said, you may change your name if you'd like, because I recognized that many people had very unpronounceable names.
Oh.
And I said, And I guess there was a psychological hurt that was still there. And so I changed my name to my father's name, which certainly didn't, I'm sure my mother didn't like. She would like for me to have changed my name to her then married name, which was Kurlander, which was a very nice name, which in retrospect I wouldn't have mind having, Kurlander, as opposed to Daniels, because Kurlander is more of a Jewish name than Daniels. So anyway, I changed my name to Daniels at that time, and I became a citizen of America. Well, it was a wonderful day for me, a wonderful day.
Do you remember it? Yeah, obviously.
Oh, well, I remember the federal building in San Diego. Remember being with a lot of people. Remember standing up there, taking the vow, feeling very good, having a few friends there, and going through, at that time, changing some of my records with the Navy. They had to change a lot of my records, and I had to make sure that my discharge papers also were consistent with my military records, so they also had to have two names on it and all that. And I made sure that was there, so there wasn't a gap of who was who. So yeah, I remember that. It was a good time.
I sort of have this image of you standing in the sunshine, because San Diego is a very sunny place.
Yes.
Coming into the sunshine out of the federal building.
Yeah.
I'm totally making it up.
Yeah.
But what happened next?
Well, then I finished my tour of duty in San Diego, and I had met interestingly how anti-Semitism just keeps, no matter how much sun there is, anti-Semitism keeps coming back into your life, where I had met a girl. We were beginning to have a relationship, and she was from Latvia. She was not Jewish, but she was going at that point, she was a student at San Diego State, and I was still in the service, and I had looked up to her because she was a college student. A lot of her friends were college students. At that point, I didn't even have a high school education. And although I was a good communicator, I was able to communicate pretty well with on a peer level. I still was looking up to her.
There's a difference between intelligence and classroom education.
Yeah, exactly.
The two are not synonymous.
Well, I didn't realize, to me it's still. So, but she was very nice, and she influenced me and do a little bit with your life. I was a lifeguard at that time. You're not going to be a lifeguard all your life. So I went to get a GED. I went to a local high school in San Diego while I was still in the service. I attended a few classes. I was able to get a GED. They were able to put a actual physical high school on the GED, so it wasn't just by mail order. So I left the service with a high school diploma, and I met her and San Diego State. She was having a wonderful relationship, but her mother hated me.
She knew you were Jewish?
Yes. I kept, I was very nice. I'm just not for the most part, I'm a likable guy. I've learned to be nice. I not an in-your-face guy. I wasn't trying to be arrogant or boring. I said, why doesn't this woman like me? I always try to open up the door for her, be a good Boy Scout. Well, I found out that she went through the war in Latvia as a non-Jew, and wouldn't you know it, the few Jewish people that were living in Latvia at that time, in her hometown, had money, and they were charging interest while they're needing the money. And whatever happened there, she came to America 20 years later, and every Jew in America, it was still a dirty pig, because 20 years earlier, some Jew was charging money during a war.
And for the record, the Latvians have a tremendous history of anti-Semitism, regardless of
I know, but that was
not.
her excuse.
Right.
And she knew, at that point, I didn't talk very much about my background. It wasn't until years later that I started talking about what I went through. Because I learned years ago just to shut up. I didn't want people feeling sorry for me. And at that point, people didn't understand. didn't know how to take all this. So, but they were from Europe. They knew I was Jewish. She had confidence in me. I felt close to her. She knew I was in a camp. This woman had not one bit of sympathy for me that I was in a camp. As far as she knew, I should have just perished with the rest of them.
So you were saying about how really out of your way you were going to make yourself liked by the mother of your girlfriend, and she just wouldn't accept it.
Yeah, it just, I think I was probably hurt as much as I was confused.
Did you want to marry her daughter?
Yes, yes. We had a very close relationship, and we were very compatible. And at that point in my life, I think the ambiguity probably wasn't as clear in my mind as it is now, even though she was not Jewish. I was being rejected by my mother because I was Jewish, and I still wanted to marry her. So I don't know what direction I was going. I wasn't very Jewish. I was non-observant, although I would never, well, let me put it this way, I didn't walk around with a star on my forehead. I didn't announce it, but if somebody asked me what religion was obviously I was Jewish. I was in the service. I had Hebrew on my dog tags, so it was obviously, I made no point about it, and I was able to met other Jewish people in service, and we did socialize, but I wasn't gravitating towards Jewish organizations and such.
Did you participate in anything Jewish in the Navy?
In the Navy? No. I think, though, a few times wherever I was, and I think maybe in Hawaii, I was in Hawaii for a couple of years, I think they had High Holy Day services at the local chapel, and they had a rabbi come by there, and I did go. And it was foreign to me on one hand because I have no training, but I felt home anyway because I knew I was part of my own people. You know, for however it was once or twice a year, you know, it happened. And that was about the extent of it. So, so that was a little bit of, you know, I mean, it was just...
It sounds heartbreaking.
Yeah, it was. So we realized, because she was... It was tough on the lady, too, because she didn't want to... She was still her mother, and she obviously didn't want to, you know, she realized, or maybe she was threatened by her mother, that if you marry me, then it would alienate her, and they've gone through a lot too. Even though they were born in America, it was just days after the war, but it was her mother who suffered mostly, and they felt very sorry for her. There was no father, they supported her and all that. So it was decided that it wasn't to be, so we did separate. And then I did continue on, though, in San Diego. I went to junior college, and I went to college, and graduated college, and went on to graduate school.
Did you work while you were in college?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I worked. I had all kinds of odd jobs. Nothing, you know, nothing of any consequences, nothing to, just enough to earn money to support myself through. And
were you eligible for GI rights?
yes, I had GI rights. At that time, it was like $175 a month. You know, it really wasn't enough. It was enough to pay for my rent, but I still had to work to support myself. But I had no problems. I always managed to find enough work and to support myself. And it was a state university, and it certainly wasn't out of my reach. And at that point, I started to associate with the Jewish, to some extent, the local Jewish community. Not very strong, but just as more of a social level. I didn't belong to any temples, but more of a social level. I started to gravitate to some peripheral Jewish community events and some singles and all that. It was never a large part of my life, but I was beginning to come a little bit out of my shell at that point. But I still had problems talking about things because at that point, when somebody found out what my background was, I would get this, "Oh, I feel so sorry for you" type of an attitude, and I just detested it. I just didn't know how to handle that, so I would just basically just avoid it. And then if somebody else found out about it, I said, "I'll only tell you if you want it for historical purposes, or if you really want to know for your own information, but God, the minute you start feeling sorry for me, you know, I just don't know how to handle it." So it wasn't until many years later that, actually it wasn't until I started to, I was married into this family in 1980 that I really started coming out of this particular shell. So,
About the war experience?
yes,
Dealing with the war
exactly.
experience.
Yeah, in fact, for many years I lied about where I was born. I mean, people say, "Well, where are you from?" I said, "I'm from New York." I said, "Oh," because I was able to get by with a New York accent.
Mm-hmm.
And then every now and then somebody with some kind of an ear for languages would say, "Well, yeah, that's New York, but there's also something else there. You know, I lived in Germany for a few years, and there's a mixture there, you know, that I would sort of downplay it a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
you know." So,
But you were in graduate school and then you completed?
yeah, then I finished graduate school, and then I went to work for a large corporation. And I went to work for them on my strength of speaking German. I actually learned German. I relearned German in graduate school. It was called the Graduate School for International Management in Phoenix, and it was a 2-year graduate school that strictly trained you in international management and business. You had to have a bachelor's degree to get into that school in the first place. And so I went there, chose European studies, and my foreign language was French. And after the first 2 weeks, I said, "Dummy, go back to German. You'll have a wonderful time rolling it off your tongue." So I went in and I just aced my German classes, relearned German, got the pronunciation right and all that, picked up the European Studies program, did very well, you know, like 2% of my class, got picked up with a very good job offer from an American can company, went to New York, trained me there, oriented me in New York, and then they moved me back to Europe.
Now, when you were in New York, did you contact your mother?
Yes, yeah. I was married at that time. I had my first marriage at that time. I had got married while I was my junior year in college. And we began to have somewhat of a normal relationship. And I knew I was going to be going to Europe. I mean, they'd already told me I'd made some trips there anyway to get me started. And today I probably wouldn't do it, but then I'd like to travel, and I wanted to travel first class for a change, or at least business class, rather than
hitching a flat car.
Steerage. So they moved me to Germany, of all places, and they settled me in Hamburg.
Did you share with them at all what your background was?
To some extent, yes. They knew I was born in Germany. My company, they looked at my background record. They knew my work experience, my academic experience was good. They knew that I spoke the language. They tested me for my understanding of getting along in a European environment. They knew that I had traveled extensively, but they didn't know it was steerage, but they knew I can talk to kings and paupers type of a thing.
But not about really your refugee experience?
No. I don't remember if they even asked, or if I had put it down, they didn't pursue it. They just figured it was enough that I knew they could drop me into any European city and that I would not get lost. So that's what it was. And so I must have been in my early 30s at the time. They moved me to Hamburg on my own. I became their manufacturer's representative for their Dutch packaging plant. And I was responsible for all of Germany. And so I was basically on the road in Germany, selling and servicing their packaging products in the different factories and clients. And so it was a good experience. It was a wonderful experience. That experience, my experience with them, they didn't have to tell me, my company didn't have to tell me what to say and what not to say. I mean, they obviously had enough confidence in me to pay me a good salary to move over there. But on my own, if I walk into a factory of nothing but Germans in Bremerhaven or Stuttgart, someplace, obviously my first words out of my mouth are not that I'm Jewish, I was in the camps. I would speak German with them, but it was with an American accent. So I said, well, yeah, I'm from America, but my parents were German, and I learned German very well, but I'm still with them. They accepted it. It was fine. They wanted to speak English with me anyway, because this was in 1969 and 1970. It wasn't as prevalent as today. It was a treat for an American to go over to Europe and learn to work as an expatriate, got paid very good money. You were living very well. And you didn't see too many American businessmen traveling around at that time. So you walk into a factory with nothing but the Germans. The only Americans they saw were tourists, not a businessman working over there. So we'd go to lunch, and I wanted to practice my English with you. And most of the time, my German was better than the English. Then. Today, right. They speak better English, but it wasn't in those days. So between my German and the English, we communicate very well. I was able to sell my equipment there and service it and troubleshoot and so forth. So occasionally I would get friendly with one or two of the people I would call on a lot, and it would be on more than just business. We would socialize a little bit, especially if I would be overnight in one of the cities, and they'd say, well, you're staying in a hotel, come over to my house for dinner. Because they wanted to be more in the business. I'm from America and all this. Occasionally I would tell them, by the way, I was born here. I would begin to relate. It was interesting reactions I would get from some of the Germans.
Why did you feel a need to do that?
Well, I became a little brazen. I wanted to test them a little bit. Maybe I was beginning to think I was living a lie. And I felt comfortable at that point that I wasn't going to jeopardize a relationship. I felt comfortable. They were younger. They were a little bit younger. They were not the old-timers. They were probably more in their 30s and 40s, and I felt that they were a little bit more liberal. They wouldn't be still stuck in the old German Hitler Aryan mentality, which I'll explain in a minute, where I experienced in Holland. So I was able to explain, and sometimes they were very gracious about it. Of course, they never knew. I didn't know. I heard about it. No German will ever admit to you that they knew what was going on, ever. And I was able to talk to Germans. Sometimes we would socialize during lunch, and I would say, without me telling them I was born there, I was still an American with a German, I'd say, curious to know, I have some people that I know in America who came from Europe, who were here during the camps and all that. They were like neighbors. And they were telling me all this thing, and so I'm curious to know what you know. It's sort of twisted around. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a shame, but nobody ever knew. Never. I never met a person. Now, I didn't meet thousands of people, but I met a lot of them. The conversation would come around to it. I was getting a little more aggressive, but I was always cloaked myself behind being an American. I never found one person that ever said, well, yeah, I knew about it. Well, yeah, down with those Jews. Mm. They were very patronizing and nice about it. So I was really never able to get underneath anybody's skin. But I traveled a lot to Holland because the factory was in Rotterdam. And the first few times I traveled to Rotterdam on business, I knew they all spoke German. So, I would communicate with the shopkeepers in German, and I would get the cold shoulder. And then I began to realize that if you're over 50 or 60, they hate the Germans. They always hated the Germans because the Germans just devastated Holland. But then I say, well, do you speak English? Oh, yes, we speak English. I'm from America. Oh, they loved the Americans. Loved the Americans. So I learned at that time of what language to speak to what age group. And because I was beginning to speak a little Dutch, picking up Dutch and a little Danish too, I traveled in that area. So there was actually a level there of what to speak to. So it was kind of an
I
experience.
see. Very clever.
Yeah.
Well, and then how you stayed with American Can Company for a while? What
I stayed with them
happened
until 1972, and they realized that their European venture was a bust. That's just another story entirely. They just couldn't compete against the European packaging companies. American Can Company was big here, but they just couldn't handle the European market. The Europeans were much more advanced in packaging equipment, in plastics, and in color technology than American Can Company was. American Can Company was making tin cans for Dole pineapple, and that was their big thing in beer cans. They got into this paperboard packaging years later, and they were really catching up to many more sophisticated companies in Sweden and in England and so forth.
And how did that affect you?
Well, they finally said that we're shutting down the international division. You're all coming back. When I say you all, me and they had another fellow in Sweden and another one in Holland. We went sort of like a team over there. And they brought us back, and they offered me a job. Actually, the fellow in Holland decided to leave the company and stay in Holland, and the fellow in Sweden decided to stay in Holland, and he stayed there. I came back to America, and I didn't like the job offers they had, so I came back to California in 1972, and just picked up a new life over here.
And you were single at that point? You're
No, I was still married.
still married?
We're still married,
Mm-hmm.
and came over here and got separated from my wife in the 1973, 74. Stayed single for a number of years. We met Joan here, began our life together.
And along the way, you've had children?
I've had one child from my first marriage, and that was he was born in 1970. And he was born right a year after I graduated from graduate school. Just before he was born in Connecticut, just before we moved the family over to Europe.
Oh. And then with Joan, you have a family?
Well, Jones has 3 children, and but when Joan and I got together, they were all 10 or under, and they're all in their late 20s, early 30s now. So I'm effectively part of their family. I have been all these years.
And you said that around 1980 is when you came out of your shell about the war experience. How did that happen?
Well, it was Joan. Joan is a wonderful Philadelphia Jewish broad. I mean, if I may say that. She's just a wonderful Jewish person. She's seeped in Judaism. And I'm very lucky that she took a lot of interest in me. More than a husband and a lover, she wanted to bring this thing out, and she started to encourage me to talk more about it. And she actually got me in touch with Sarah Moskowitz, who wrote a book and started to interview some of the child survivors. And through some communication that Joan had with somebody else, I was one of the first interview groups. It was like a rap session of children who had gone through the war, either as survivors in the camps or as hidden children.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened, I guess, in 1981, 82, or so forth, I don't remember exactly. And so I went in, and it was sort of like we had some discussions, groups, rap sessions, they called them, a half a dozen of us. And, little by little, I started talking more about it, and I felt a greater level of comfort by talking to other people who were in the camps, and I realized that maybe I was feeling sorry for myself. I realized some of them went through a lot worse than I did. I've realized that children who were hidden had their own problems, maybe a lot worse than I did, because they didn't know from day to day where they were going, living in a basement or in an attic or something. At least I knew where I was. So I was able to expand my experiences a little bit more with other people, and seeing that they went through other experiences, so I can incorporate mine. And I never really felt myself, I always felt myself lucky. And the thing is, Theresienstadt was not a death camp. And a lot of people, Jews also, will say, well, it wasn't one of the bad camps. And I agree with them. I'm not going to sit there and say, there are people who went through horrors, and I know that, those who survived. So I've recognized that Theresienstadt was a lucky place to be. And I'm extremely lucky because I found out many years later that about 15,000 children went through that camp. And then about 100 of them made it at the end of the war, and I was one of those 100. It was a very eerie feeling when you know that you're part of a small group, so I was very, very lucky. But still, on the other hand, I'm saying, well, was it an abnormal life? Did it do me any good? I don't know. It's hard to say. You know, I think I feel I'm well adjusted, except that, you know, I suppose I could be better adjusted if I'd grown up in a more of a Jewish home, or if it wasn't a different environment. I don't know.
I did want to ask you one question about being Jewish. It seems like it's been such a burden and a source of really torture for you in so many points in your life. Why be Jewish?
Why be Jewish? It's a wonderful question. Well, first of all, I have no choice. I mean, I truly do not have a choice. I mean, I'm Jewish because the world says I'm Jewish. I mean, I went through it. I went through because I was Jewish. It was not my choice. On the other hand, the more I learn about it, the more I read about it, and the more people that I meet, I find there's a lot of pride in it. Sometimes I'm a little bit uncomfortable with an overabundance of Jewish pride. I feel sometimes it's a little, personally, I think it's a little bit overbearing when I hear people say, well, look at this brilliant scholar. I mean, he's Jewish, of course. Deep down inside, I feel great. I feel wonderful because I feel I'm part of that. I feel great because our values are wonderful, because of education. Even whatever little Judaism my mother had, she recognized I had to have an education. Even living in a dinky apartment in Berlin, she knew that I had to read, I had to do something, because she recognized that whatever little education I had was going to help me on later in life. And I had no values when I left. I mean, whatever values I had when I left the service, I mean, I could have gotten any kind of job, but, you know, it was uppermost to get an education. And where that came from, I don't know, but I know now that in Judaism, education is foremost. It's very important. It was just never an issue. And I went through it without any problems, even though I had nobody telling me, you got to get it, you got to get it. It's just that, well, maybe, I don't know. I hate to say it, that it's inherent, but somehow or other it came through to me. And yeah, there is pride, and if I can learn to be more aggressive and more outgoing about it, I would be maybe just as overbearing as Joan is, as some other people, but I'm still very reticent about it, even though inside I feel it, but I'm not, you know, there is a lot of pride. And when I do go to services, it's just really great to be with everybody else who, you know, we're like of one mind. And although I'm not observant in the traditional sense, I will never, ever deny the fact I'm Jewish. And people at work, I work in a traditional non-Jewish environment in a bank. I don't think there are 5 people in my division of 180 that are Jewish, but everybody knows I'm Jewish. They know I take a personal day during the high holidays. They know why I take it. I have no problem with it. And when they see I have no problem with it, they accept me, I think. I don't make any excuses for it. You know, so in my own way, I think I don't know if I'll ever go any further of it. I don't know Hebrew. Maybe when I go to Israel, which we've put off 2 trips already because of other pressing things. Maybe once I hit Israel and come back, maybe there'll be this spark that'll force me to go beyond that. But I know a lot of our friends go to Israel all the time, but they don't know more Hebrew than I do. I don't know if they're more Jewish than I am. It's just a wonderful experience for them.
Maybe
and they have that over me.
Maybe it'll just be another step
Yes.
in a connection,
Absolutely.
in forging a connection.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us this morning. I understand we have some pictures to look at.
Yeah.
So why don't we go and set those up? Is there anything that I haven't asked you about, though, before we shut off that you'd like to say?
Gosh, no, I don't know. It's hard to. No, I thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share, you know, my little life with millions of others who don't have the opportunity to share it.
Well, we're
And,
honored that you invited us into your home to hear.
Thank you.
Your story is very different because you were so much younger when it started.
Cry.
Why now? If you could say.
For all those people who can't tell their story. Thank you.
Go.
That is a picture of me, I believe, taken in the apartment in Berlin. Probably, I must have been, looks like I may be 4 or 5 years old, probably a year or two before we were taken to Theresienstadt.
1941 or 40?
Probably 1940 or so.
Okay.
That is my mother and sister and myself, probably in the displaced DP camp in Deggendorf. My sister must be a year or so old, and it's probably just prior to us coming to America. And that was probably in 1946. Well, probably closer to 1947. We came over here in August, so that was probably taking us in that year. That is my sister sitting on my mother's lap and me in the DP camp in Deggendorf, probably taken in 1947.
And what are their names?
My sister's name is Evelyn, and of course my mother, Hilda Berlowitz. That was taken in the Navy boot camp in San Diego in 1958. I'm on the right, and those are two of my buddies. I do not recall their names at that time. That is, I'm holding my son Eric Daniels. He appeared to be a few months old, taken in Connecticut in probably in the middle of 1970. That is with my son Eric, who appears to be about 6 years old at the time, taken in 1976 in a little park in West Los Angeles,
California.
California. I'm giving my wife Joan a wonderful hug because I love her so much, and this was probably taken in our home, probably 1980 or 81.
In
Yeah, our home in Los Angeles, California. This is the wedding picture of my daughter and son-in-law taken at the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, California on February 28, 1993. Starting from your right is Don, my son, my mother-in-law Ruth, my wife Joan, Michael Kirsch, my son-in-law, of course Ilana. Next to Ilana on the left is myself, is me, Ram, and my son Eric.
And Ram?
Ram is also one of my stepson.
Okay.
This is a picture of my son Eric, who you saw on the extreme left on that last wedding picture, with his wife Julie. This was taken in Portland, Oregon, July 1st, 1994. It was his wedding picture. To the right is my son-in-law Mike Hirsch and my daughter Ilana. In between Eric and Ilana, you see Ram. And then on the left of Julie is Don, and my wife Joan and me.